Good evening and welcome to the meeting of the Climate Policy and Scrutiny Subcommittee. I'm Councillor Alan Edwards, the chair of the subcommittee. Could members of the committee please introduce yourself, starting on our left, please?
I'm Councillor Peter May from County Line.
Thank you.
Good evening, Chair. Councillor Sharon Ainsley, St Mary's Ward.
Thank you.
Good evening, Councillor Tim Copsey, St Michael's.
Thank you. The first item is apologies for absence.
I don't believe there were any apologies for absence this evening.
Thank you. And are there any members' interests to declare? None? Okay, thank you. So item 3 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of September. Members, you should all have had copies of those in advance. Are these agreed as a correct record? Yes. Thank you very much.
Just anywhere. Oh, there you go. It's on the back.
Forget today's date. Right. Thank you. Okay, so agenda item 4 is biodiversity net gain update. We have a report here from our Assistant Director for Climate and Growth, Amanda Parrott, which provides an update on the implementation of the new laws and regulations around biodiversity net gain in the Borough. Ms Parrott, if you could introduce the report, please.
So whilst several of you on the committee attended training and briefing on biodiversity net gain, I'm going to call it BNG because otherwise it's going to take a long time to get through the report. I'm just going to recap. So it's a legal requirement that came into effect as part of the Environment Act for large sites in February and for smaller sites in April of this year. It is a requirement for any loss of biodiversity arising from development or other activity to be offset by a gain of at least 10% greater than that which is being lost, and for that gain to be provided and protected for a minimum of 30 years. Account is given when those calculations are being made to the types of habitat being lost and gained and the difficulty in providing that type of habitat, and the location of any reprovision, and then preference is given within the calculation to any provision in strategically important locations, typically those identified through a local nature recovery strategy. Since the requirement for BNG came into effect, we have received 9 applications where biodiversity net gain provision would be required. However, 4 of these applications were for self-build homes and are exempt from providing biodiversity net gain as a consequence of the regulations around biodiversity net gain. None of the remaining 5 applications have commenced development yet, so they wouldn't have been required to make their provision yet. You're only required to make your provision if you actually implement your planning application. When we reported on biodiversity net gain previously, the proposal was to put in place guidance to support small-scale developers deliver biodiversity net gain. We had draft supplementary guidance, which you went through, and this was consulted on earlier this year. However, since that time, further national guidance has been provided, and that guidance has been updated a few times as well to reflect practice as it has occurred. And it has also become clear, not just in Castle Point, but across the country, that smaller developers are seeking to avoid doing biodiversity net gain where possible through the self-build exemption route. So this is actually limiting the effectiveness of any guidance that we have prepared, because actually it's not being used because people are finding the exemption route. We have, however, also generated new evidence around biodiversity net gain. So where we have worked with the county on the local nature recovery strategy that you considered at your last meeting, we have contributed and benefited from the identification of strategic sites where B&G could be provided both in the borough and more broadly across Essex. We've also identified areas of open space through our open space assessment work where we could deliver B&G on our own land and actually contribute to overall be a net contributor to biodiversity within the borough. There is therefore scope to look at whether we could be more proactive around our approach to biodiversity net gain. Not only looking at how we support developers deliver biodiversity net gain, but also look at how we encourage biodiversity net gain sites within the borough to meet the broader need for such sites. There is a separate requirement in the Environment Act to prepare a biodiversity report, and it is proposed that not only do we finalise the preparation of the developer guidance document, that we prepare a biodiversity report that looks at how we could deliver a range of biodiversity net gain measures across the borough's area so that the area is a net contributor to biodiversity. It is proposed that we look at doing this report in the new year with a report about that report to this committee in the springtime.
Thank you. Members, do you have any questions on the report?
The sites that have been identified, is that in the public domain yet?
Yep, so when we went out to consultation on the issues and options for the Castle Point plan, the open space assessment work that we had undertaken was published at the same time. There's a chunky report, but there's actually also a ARC story map that goes with it, so residents can access that information quite easily and in quite a sort of visual way.
Councillor Copsey?
It's just more of an observation than a direct question. I have to say I've always been a bit of a sceptic about biodiversity net gain, so I have to take that into account because I've seen so many scenarios where you've got beautiful land with wildlife, nature, trees, different species, and then it's obliterated with concrete and a housing estate, and yet somehow miraculously it's got 10% net gain on site. So I remain a bit sceptical. However, it's law. So now I flip that and think, how can we use the legislation to benefit our borough? And as we've got a lot of green spaces, that seems like something to try and take advantage of because it could help protect some of our green spaces. And there was in the report, I think it was 6.4, it talks about tying this in with the new Castle Point plan and with the possibility of exceeding the sort of 10% target. I suppose there is a bit of a question there. Is that a possibility then that higher targets could be achieved?
So we're going to do the viability testing, and I suppose with any development, the value of the development is a cake, and you take out various slices for the value of the land, the cost it takes to build it and so forth, and you're left with a slice of cake that is for all the goodies that you want. And it depends on the size of that slice of cake as to how much you want to put towards biodiversity net gain in terms of the cost of the development. But the choice will be there for you, and it will depend on the slice of that cake. And that varies on different types of sites. So if you're talking about urban sites, the cake is typically smaller, and the slice that's left for the goodies, the things that you want for your community, is typically smaller as a consequence. So you might not be able to do everything you want to do on an urban site. If you were to have greenbelt, greenfield sites in your plan, the cake is bigger, the slice for the things that you want for the community are bigger, and you would potentially be able to take a bigger contribution for things like biodiversity net gain. So the choices vary depending on the sites that you select to put in the plan, but there may be sites where you could take a larger slice for biodiversity net gain.
Thanks.
Councillor May.
Thank you. This is just a general question. Do we do this to our own contractors? I mean, we're building, like we've built new council houses, which has been a positive thing, on unused garage sites and things like that. So do we, like, do our own contractors abide by this?
So this became law for large sites in February and for small sites in April. I don't think that we as a council have made any applications to ourselves since that time. However, if we were to make an application for any type of building, whether it be a council house or whether it be to, I don't know, build a new yard for our waste disposal vehicles or whatever, if it was on a site that had a biodiversity value, so if it wasn't on a brownfield site, if it was on a greenfield site, then it would be as applicable to our proposals as it is to, I don't know, Redrow if they were building houses, or to some big commercial company who wanted to build warehousing or whatever. So it'd be as applicable to us as to those companies. Okay. So biodiversity net gain is about ecology only, and biodiversity net gain isn't applicable where you're looking to renovate an existing building. So, okay.
Thank you. Just one from me, if you don't mind. We say at 5.4 about a pattern emerging across the country of the smaller applications being submitted under self-build exemption. Are you aware of any steps being taken to close that, and do we see that having a significant impact going forward? Because it looks like a fairly major loophole in the legislation.
So as part of our response to the National Planning Policy Framework as a council, we did sort of highlight it where there was the opportunity to do so. But there are 8 organisations who have collectively written to the government, particularly highlighting this point. Some of them are nature conservation organisations, but actually others are organisations such as the Planning Portal, who see that this should be being implemented, but see actually being abused, I suppose, by way of sort of use of the exemption. So those 8 organisations have clubbed together to write to the government, sort of highlighting those particular issues and the challenges that that actually presents in developing the biodiversity net gain market, because it is in effect a market around the sort of valuing and trading of those biodiversity, so that it actually starts to have a value that is more equivalent to the market for housing or other land uses, and therefore actually gain some traction. So they have written in that respect to see if that loophole can be closed.
Thank you. It's encouraging to hear. And are we in any way sort of protected with other rules that we've got in place?
So the regulations in relation to biodiversity net gain have a self-build exemption, but don't have anything to hold people to account thereafter. So they can say, oh, I'm going to self-build it. They get their planning permission and then they sell it and it's built by a house builder. However, because we have community infrastructure levy in place, when they apply for self-build exemption under biodiversity net gain, they also have to apply for self-build exemption under community infrastructure levy. Otherwise, they're required to pay the community infrastructure levy. If they then sell their property, within the 3-year period, once it's been occupied and they've notified us that it's been occupied under self-build rules, they would then be required to pay their community infrastructure levy. So there's a lot more checks and balances in Castle Point or in other places that have community infrastructure levy relative to areas that don't have community infrastructure levy.
Thank you. That's good to hear. Members, if there are no other questions, we've been asked to note the report. Okay. Sorry, Councillor Ainsley, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, my question was very similar to yours. I was concerned about the self-build, but also regarding genuine self-build and smaller properties. I know that it doesn't come within the law, but I would like for Castle Point to be known as Green Castle Point, and know that we're encouraging people to plant trees and bushes and increase biodiversity and net gain wherever possible. If that be in the case of just sedum on top of a bike shed or something like that, is it something that we could possibly put guidance in and in our information to potential developers, or developers being somebody just building their own property or extending their own property? Do you think there's something that we could do? I know we can't legislate for it because it's not part of planning law, but every little helps, as they say.
So if that's something you wish to say, we can certainly feed that back to the Castle Point Plan Board, because there is the opportunity to look through the Castle Point Plan as to whether we put in place a policy around the urban greening factor, which is a recommendation from Natural England. It's come through in their consultation response. It's also a recommendation of the local nature recovery strategy as well, that we look to consider including that in planning policy. So it's something we can look at through the Castle Point Plan Board.
Councillor Copsey.
Thank you. Just going back, you touched on the revised, potentially revised MPPF. I know it's up in the air, but as far as you know, is there likely to be an impact on BNG, or is at the moment sort of the vibe that that's carrying on as per? Do you see what I mean by that? Yeah.
So my understanding is that they're not looking to amend BNG. The question that they posed was around that sort of interplay between Greenbelt and BNG and how much weight should be placed on local nature recovery strategies where they overlap with Greenbelt. That was the question that they posed. So I think that it's very much the case that they're looking to keep BNG, keep local nature recovery strategies, and we're just interested in that interplay between Greenbelt and biodiversity.
Thanks. Just final one, if I may. What we're looking to sort of tonight to look to approve or note or whatever, is that going to be a route forward that will get us to the point where, for example, some of these sites within the borough that have been identified almost could be banked as it were as a potential site for? So in other words, someone's building something somewhere else and could say, great, that lovely spot of green in Castle Point, we'll use that as our place for our biodiversity net gain.
So I think we need to be careful that there's a sort of interplay there between the Castle Point Plan and decisions that the Castle Point Plan Board and ultimately the council make and what is in this strategy. But certainly I think that there is scope for developing a strategy around biodiversity which is more proactive than just giving some guidance to some developers. It is about saying maybe we've got some land, maybe we could work with other landowners as well. But I think we need to see where the Castle Point Plan lands and then see where the opportunities are and take it from there.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Thank you. So we were asked to just note the report, but in the conversation it's and that the preferred option is to prepare a biodiversity report incorporating a range of BNG measures. You did mention that you were planning to finalise the BNG guidance that's mentioned as option 2. So I would propose that we note that we will finalise the BNG guidance and also prepare a biodiversity report which incorporates the range of BNG measures. If that's if we're all in agreement with that. Okay. So if I
So that's options 8.2, option 2.
yeah. So basically, I'm suggesting that our recommendation is option 2, which is at 8.2, complete the guidance, and also option 3, prepare the biodiversity report, rather than just do one or the other, because that work's substantively already underway, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I have a seconder for that, and then we'll...
I'm happy to second that.
Thank you. And are we all agreed? Great. Thank you very much. And so now agenda item 5, which is the decarbonisation of council buildings. Members, we have a report from the Director of Commercial and Assets, Matt Harwood-White, which sets out the approach the council is taking to decarbonise its buildings. Mr Harwood-White, could you please introduce the report?
Thank you, Chair. Evening, members. Really pleased to be here this evening to set out this report before you this evening. It sets out the proactive approach I've been taking to accessing grant funding to support the council's approach to decarbonisation of its assets, and sets a clear strategy going forward. Chair, it sets out the approach the council is taking to decarbonise its buildings. On the 5th of October 2022, the motion by Councillor Walter is set out in the report. I won't read it in full, but it is out in the report. And this report provides an update on the strategic approach the council has taken to address that motion. Chair, the council is working towards delivering the recommendations of the Essex Climate Action Commission that seeks to achieve net zero by 2050. In order to deliver against this ambition, the council needs to develop adaptation and mitigation plans for its build to state. As set out in the report, heating accounts for circa 40% of the council's carbon emissions. Therefore, it's necessary, for the council to consider options for reducing these carbon emissions to support our objectives. It is a new and significant piece of work for the council, and as such, officers recognise that we need to seek relevant specialist advice and guidance to achieve this ambition. And to that end, I led a team to apply for funding from the Low Carbon Skills Fund. That fund focuses on decarbonising the way buildings are heated. It supports public sector organisations to engage specialists and experts to identify and develop what's known as heat decarbonisation plans, with a focus on energy efficiency and low carbon heat upgrade projects. We took a targeted approach to the assets on the assets we were to include in the project to deliver the greatest impact for the council. And I'm pleased to confirm, and as set out in the report, that the council was successful in securing approximately £84,000 from the fund in July of this year. That work is ongoing and is progressing to schedule at pace, and we should receive the reports by the end of the calendar year. In summary, the work set out in the report supports our strategic approach to decarbonisation of our built estate, and will ensure the council is well placed for future decarbonisation opportunities, and crucially, grant funding for those schemes to see them delivered. Chair, as the report sets out, it's an important and proactive step in the work the council is doing to ensure our built assets are both environmentally and financially sustainable. Chair, I hope that's useful for the summary. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Members, do you have any questions? Councillor May.
Yeah, sorry, just one. On 5.4, sorry, on 5.4, you've got the assets we're working on, but at Waterside Farm, it says Waterside Farm Leisure Centre and the bungalow, but there's also a house at the back of Waterside. Is that included in that?
So the assets were, I say, targeted to deliver that highest impact. We could only deliver There was a limited amount of funding. We had to take a targeted approach, so only the assets listed there are included in this phase. Doesn't preclude or exclude from future opportunities, but for this particular fund, it's just those listed in the report, Chair. No problem.
Are there any other questions? Councillor Copsey.
Yes, thank you. First of all, just want to say thank you to the officers for securing funding to try and get some progress on the decarbonisation, because I think this is, well, one, is something that urgently needs moving forward. Two, it's in a way that I see this as part of a broader picture of achieving more environmentally friendly progress throughout the organisation, and so I think this is positive steps forward. But also, I'm pleased that we're funding it through grant funding, because obviously all local authorities are in a tight financial situation, so that shows some wisdom there as well. So very pleased to see some progress on this. And it is quite, there's 6.2 jumped out at me, that the leisure centre, the project is estimated to reduce consumption by 143,000 kilowatt hours at the site per year, and saving £30,000 annually. So to me, we're moving into the realms of win-win, some investment, and then we're going to have long-term savings, plus we're going to help the environment as well. So that gets a thumbs up from me. I do have a question about 7.2, only in the sense of, it says, as part of the Council's transformation service review for the climate and growth services complete, Council is currently processing recruiting to posts. Is that post or post? I think what's going through my mind there, I get that you need bodies to do the work to achieve X, but I'm also always mindful of the financial implications of things. So just a little curious about how that's been managed.
Ms. Parrott, if you can take that one.
So we've had an audit report back a couple of years ago, and that was then reflected in the work that the LGA reported to us around decision-making accountability, that we have a gap in the organisation in terms of coordinating and managing our response to climate action, to the extent that the organisation didn't have the capacity to drive forward that climate action work. So a post has been created within my service, a senior climate action officer, whose role it will be to drive that work. So they will, and coordinate it. So once they're in post, they'll be responsible for the strategy, but then working across the organisation to make sure that climate action is embedded further within the work that Matt's teams are doing, not just in terms of estates, but also in terms of grounds maintenance and our parks and open spaces, but then working with procurement to make sure that where we're embedding social value into our projects, we're ensuring that social value also covers things around climate action and reduced emissions and so forth. So it is just a post at the moment, a single post at the moment, but it's about making sure that someone's coordinating it and sort of spreading that across the organisation through their skills and expertise.
Thank you.
Councillor Ainsley.
Yes, I'd like to thank you as well for the report and for seeking the funding. I was wondering two things. Have we looked at the possibility of heat source pumps? And I think that you can get grant funding for public buildings. I might be wrong on that, but I thought I'd read it somewhere. And question two is, have we, I think you might have just touched on this actually, Amanda, have we been asking or selecting our suppliers based on their carbon footprint? And do we ask for reports and evidence on their carbon score?
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the first. If Amanda can take the second, that's probably the best way to deal with that, if that's okay. In terms of the first question, thank you for that question. In short, it would include that option. The Low Carbon Schools Fund would look at identifying a range of options it would rank them, it would score them, it would look at the deliverability and the cost. So I'd anticipate, yes, to include that. Whether it's deliverable would be the next stage, but at this point, I'd like to cast a wide net, look at what those opportunities are, look at what the costs are and what's deliverable, and then discuss that with the specialists and colleagues to see what we can actually do to deliver that best impact for those buildings. Hope that helps. It's taking a wide view at this point, but it could include it. Indeed, but at this point, yes, we'd cast a wide net to see what those opportunities look like. Thank you.
So in terms of carbon calculation, there's 3 scopes. There's sort of heat, there's energy that you use in a building, and then there's the carbon that's consumed by your suppliers. And at this point in time, we're not terribly strong, as indeed a lot of local authorities and organisations are not, around that supplier aspect. So what we're looking at is working with colleagues across Essex on that social value piece in terms of our procurement, and our procurement officer, Lauren, is working with colleagues across Essex on that. And we're also talking with our neighbouring authorities, particularly in Brentwood and Rochford, because there's someone who's been looking at this for a little while, around whether we can, how we can use digital technology to ourselves monitor more effectively how we use or how we use energy and generate carbon, but also how we could use similar tools with our suppliers so that they can report more effectively into our system. So if we put those requirements into our contracts, how can we actually get information from them that is accurate, useful, effective? So we're doing a piece of work around that at the moment, working with colleagues.
Are there any more questions from the committee? I did have one myself. Just on the at 6.1, we mentioned the successful request for funding or successful grant application for Waterside Farm. Can you just clarify whether the solar panels there are for heat or for electricity?
Chair, those panels would support the heating of the site, so it refers to heating. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Members, with no more questions, are we happy to note the report and put it forward to Cabinet? Agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes our business for the meeting this evening, and we're closing the meeting at 19:33. Thank you very much.